Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, How 3D Surgical Model Printing Can Help Improve Insights from Medical Imaging Data, presented by Healthcare Innovation. My name's David Rath. I'm a senior editor at Healthcare Innovation, and today's program is sponsored by IBM Watson Health. Thanks to our sponsor and to our audience for giving us your time and attention today. Before we get started, we have a few housekeeping details. To submit a question, please use the Q&A box to the left of your video window at any time. You don't have to wait until the end of the program. For technical issues, please press F5 to refresh. And if that doesn't work, you can submit a question with your issue through the Q&A panel. Finally, you can join the webinar conversation on Twitter. You can tweet using the hashtag HILiveWebinar. The presentation is available under the Event Resource tab on your screen. So I'm going to introduce our speakers for today. We have three. Dr. Henry Feldman, Assistant Professor of Medicine at Harvard Medical School and Deputy Chief Medical Officer for Development at IBM Watson Health. Dr. Solomon Dadia, a Clinical Advisor to the Board of Directors at Matrix Global Services 3D Division. And Dr. David Gruen, Chief Medical Officer of IBM Watson Health. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Gruen to begin the conversation today.
Thanks, David, for the kind introductions. I'll also add that I'm also a practicing radiologist, and I think that as we talk about 3D printing, we're going to be talking about the intersection of multiple specialties and how 3D printing can help optimize across the clinical care continuum. So today, we're going to explore with Henry and Solomon how 3D surgical model printing can help improve insights from medical imaging data. For example, 3D printed surgical models can be a precise communication tool for the radiologist, a planning aid for the experienced surgeon, and a visualization aid for training and educating purposes throughout healthcare. As we all know, and in front of us you have a broad spectrum of as a team sport. It's what patients expect and demand to get the best outcomes, and 3D printing has the opportunity to really enhance that care. With that as background, welcome to this webinar, and let's get started. I'd like to start with the first question for Solomon. What type of insights from 3D surgical models have you found most helpful in your surgical planning?
Well, there are a lot. Well, I'll start with a small introduction of myself. I'm a consultant orthopedic oncologist and a surgeon for many years, and I established a 3D printing lab in our hospital before 5 years. And well, if I can pick one of the most impact of this 3D flow, I can think of the first step of segmentation. I think the first step of segmentation is doing the most impact of engaging and recruiting surgeons to this 3D thinking. We are used as surgeons to think 2D. Although we are operating on 3D, you are thinking because of the imaging data that we are getting those imaging with 2D images, 2D plans, and creating our own, each person with his own abilities and with own creativity builds his own image of the 3D model or the 3D pathology and anatomy in his mind. But while we are operating, we have to be standardized as all surgeons. By doing segmentation, by recruiting surgeons for the first step of segmentation, we are learning on the pathology and the anatomy a great deal, because going slice by slice, even segmentation softwares have sometimes semi-automate or a fully automate algorithms. Recruiting surgeons in this step will do the most impact of improving their knowledge of the pathology, improving their knowledge on the surgery, and their planning. Their planning will change a lot while doing this step.
It sounds like as a radiologist, our role is going to become increasingly important to provide not just 2D, but 3D insights to help you do your job better. So for Henry, how does your group collaborate with surgeons, radiologists, and other team members at Harvard and at Tufts when you're creating 3D surgical models or surgical guides to help patient care?
Oh, thanks, Dave. So like Solomon, I guess I should tell folks that I am a practicing nocturnist at Beth Israel Deaconess Medical Center in Boston, and I also teach at the Cummings School of Veterinary Medicine at Tufts. And I think actually the interesting thing is the role of the radiologist in that collaboration, because we're starting to do something, and traditionally we would go to the radiologist and say, I want to look at the tumor in the kidney. And so the radiologist would be like, well, an MRI is your best test. But now we're saying, I need to produce a 3D model that I'm going to print. And printability is not something, evolution worried about when it made femurs and scapulas and stuff. It's more like the printer's limitations now have to be accommodated in the imaging. And so our radiologists are starting to think about how to segment images in a way that they are easily and manipulated for 3D printing. And that's been an interesting journey of working with the surgeons to find out what is it that they need on their model. And then with the radiologist of, okay, what are the knobs you have in your magical imaging software that lets you produce a better model for the surgeon purposes? And for us, the primary collaboration has been not actually for elective surgeries, although that's certainly frequent. It's more for trauma, for instance, orthotrauma. So our orthopedic trauma surgeons will get a case that'll come in 5 o'clock in the evening, and they're planning to do a fixation the next morning, and so need a surgical guide. So we'll work with the radiologist to get the CT with the slices the way that's going to produce the best clinical image, because obviously we don't want to just waste a CT, but also that will produce the best 3D model for printing. Then we'll print it ourselves and actually then take that model out to our central sterilization lab so the guides are usable by the orthopedic surgeon the next morning, sterile in the OR. And that's been an education on everybody's part, but I think as Solomon pointed out, the journey itself is educational for everybody. So the radiologists have learned a lot more about what the surgeons want from them, and the surgeons have learned a lot about what all the different knobs are in imaging. And so they ask for better, imaging choices for themselves.
So if you want to be an early adopter of 3D surgical model printing, and I guess this is both for Solomon and for Henry, where would you start? Which are the subjects do you think that are optimum to get started with 3D printing? And what do you think are the early barriers to adoption of 3D surgical model printing, implant guide technologies? How is a radiologist and a surgical team to get started on this process? Solomon, why don't you start us off here?
Well, I saw lots of cases that hospitals or physicians or surgeons start at the end. They're buying a machine, they're buying a printer and put it in a hospital, and nothing happens. So I think the first thing is education. To try to engage surgeons to adopt this technology is education. And it starts from doing the first case and the second case by engaging to the process. There are a few steps of the process that are the surgeon is mandatory to be part of it. And if you're not part of it, if you just as a 3D printing lab delivers those deliveries to a surgeon, he won't appreciate it. I think the first thing is education and engaging him from the first step and bring the surgeons to understand the value of the model, the 3D model. It could be the digital at first and then the printed at last. And the barriers, I think barriers, as I started, are surgeons, not the technology. Technology is there, technology is available in different levels and in the most highest levels. And what matters what we take from it. Here in Israel, in Tel Aviv, we don't get those segmentations from radiology, so we have to do that by ourselves. That's the reason that in Israel and few other countries in Europe, those initiatives of 3D printing labs are coming from surgeons because we need those segmentation to plan our surgeries, and then it comes from surgeons' initiatives. But those are the motivated surgeons. There are plenty of unmotivated surgeons because they are used to work as traditionally they learn from their mentors, and the technology must change their way of thinking or otherwise. So they will come with fixed ideas. And we saw that in many cases, surgeons that came to the lab with fixed idea how they want to plan their surgery, and they didn't value the 3D flow. And then after doing the first case, the second case, they understand the value of giving some time to segmentation, thinking of the planning, and executing with 3D printing tools.
So it's interesting. On one of our earlier conversations, you shared that you don't do complex pelvic surgery, you and your team, without a 3D model now, so that you're so fully prepared going in. And it struck me that as a patient, that's what I would want. I'd want you to know exactly what you're going to do before you pick up your scalpel and scrub. And so education does sound like a big piece of this. Henry, what are your thoughts on this? How is education impacting?
So education is certainly important, but I think actually what I took away from what Solomon just said, which I cannot agree with more, which is it's not the technology. Just like in radiology, GE puts a sexy new purple sticker on the front of the CT. You don't go out and buy it. I mean, aside from the fact that they're expensive, it's driven by your need. You're like, I need a 256 detector scanner now, not because 256 is more than the 128 we had last year, but because a bunch of studies aren't currently at the quality level or meeting the need of the end user, i.e. the surgeon or physician that is asking for the study, because of motion artifact or whatever the need is for that new device. And so the same has to be true in the OR. So what's the problem you're currently having that you can't solve using the traditional methods? I mean, obviously we've done surgery for thousands of years, so we didn't do it with 3D printers. So what problem are you having now that you don't understand how to solve? And then we have an education program. I actually started a course in our Department of Surgery around 3D modeling, 3D printing, CAD/CAM, medical device design. We sort of rolled it all into one to understand sort of the ideation of how to use this technology to achieve an answer. So in our orthopedic department, we don't do, except for really, really urgent cases where we just don't have time, placement of a implant like a plate across a fracture without 3D printed surgical guides, because we know that we would go back at an M&M and look and you'd say, oh, well, the holes weren't exactly where they should have been, or they weren't perfectly true to the plate. And so there was a tiny bit of motion. And so we didn't get a good union on those bones. And so that's what you're driving back from. And then you go to someone and you say, okay, I have this problem. How can I get better surgical guides than the off-the-shelf pre-made ones that you can get from the implant manufacturers? Oh, 3D printing and imaging is the way to go. Okay, what tools do we need to do that? So get the tools. And then how do we use those tools? And so we've taken an internal program to teach people about the technologies. And you can't just do it where, similar to all the other silly training you have to do in the hospital about like mask and, documentation and stuff. You actually have to do it live. Like we have a lab, right? And you go and you're like, okay, bring one of your cases to the lab and let's do that. And then we sort of document all the steps they took along the way, so that when they go back to their practice, they, have a model to put against their own workflow. And I think not trying to drive it through technology, but drive it through the clinical need has been the most successful.
So it's interesting. It sounds like in your practice, and clearly you're at a high-level academic practice, to not use 3D printing almost begets an M&M assessment of why not. Yet that's clearly not the standard of care across the other 99% of healthcare institutions. So what do those institutions need to do to get started? Where should they get started? How do they get started? Who should the champions be? If I wanted to bring this to a community hospital, what would you recommend? What are the specialties and so on? And I'll ask Solomon the same question next.
So to me, the great thing, like most of these kinds of technologies that the costs have dropped to the point where it used to be, 3D printers were big industrial machines and they cost $500,000 and you had to get the guy that came along with it. But, now you can put a printer on your desk that is, accurate to 20 microns for a few $1,000s, right? And that can produce FDA certified clinical models. I mean, you can do, incredibly high quality work. And so since it's not the cost, you really have to figure out an education model. And many of the surgical societies, I was supposed to be speaking in a week at running a surgical 3D printing workshop at a conference, which now has been delayed a year due to COVID. But that was the goal, was to have people intensely sit from community practices, for 3 days, learning all the workflows, doing it repeatedly, understand, like anything, like anybody who, in medical school, when you did your gram stain, you saw how incredibly easy it was to screw up a gram stain. A few extra drops of alcohol and everything's gram negative. And so I think learning how to recover from failures, because in the beginning, you're going to have some, and being able to fix those failures so that you can have successful outcomes, I think is really where the success is going to come. And partnering with someone who already has expertise. So for instance, Harvard Medical School is located amongst 5 of the major engineering colleges in Massachusetts, and we've brought in either faculty or students from those universities, from their engineering programs, to sort of be like teaching assistants for the surgeons. And that has also been very successful in that it's great for the students to learn from the surgeons about what happens in clinical 3D printing, and for the surgeons to learn from these students and faculty who have an expertise they don't.
Solomon, how do we spread the good word?
Well, I totally agree with Henry. I will just add that from my perspective, the first thing is to engage surgeon in a hospital. From my experience, being as a 3D printing hub in a hospital, made a lot of this progress of adoption of surgeons, because in the busy day of a surgeon to try to sit and work remotely on a planning or segmentation, if to choose to do it remotely, or if there is a 3D printing hub in a hospital, definitely a 3D printing hub in a hospital will win. This is a big step of the engagement of the surgeons to the process. There's nothing fancy that should be done. No big printers, no expensive printers. Leave the printing to be outsourced. It's okay to outsource the printing at the beginning. Bring an engineer or a medical designer in-house and start to engage surgeon. And then step by step, surgeon by surgeon, with education, do like an educational day to help surgeons to use those software, segmentation software and CAD software. It's available and it should be widely available in each surgeon computer. And if you do those simple measures, simple printer, one or two expertise, like an engineer, medical designer, to a big hospital, it's enough to start, and leave those fancy printing to be outsourced, or even start with simple printing. And after a while you adopt a bit of, and you look this adoption and acceptance of surgeon to go to the next step, then you can establish a bigger hub, a bigger printer, and then you can do much more of printing, planning your tooling, and go to implants. But I think you have to spend a year or two in adoption and education inside your hospital with very, very cheap measures.
I think that's a really important point, which is that to get started, you don't need to invest in a multi-million-dollar 3D printing lab. There are really good available commercial printing processes, you need a couple champions who want to show how this can have a very positive and beneficial impact upon your community. Coming back, because we don't
can I just add one small thing? So for us, we have the advantage that directly next door to Harvard Medical School is Harvard Dental School. And, you know, dentists are basically the world's most specialized orthopedic surgeons, right? They operate on one bone all the time. And those dental students nowadays, I mean, there is no dental practice, at least that I've seen in the United States, doesn't have 3D printing, either in-house or they send out. And because all of the dental implants are bespoke pieces of jewelry, essentially. And so they're really expert in that. And so when we went to establish a printing lab, we actually had them walk up the street and say, okay, how do you teach this? How do you establish your lab? Because they have them right on site. And it was actually really valuable to hear from them because they're doing it at a volume that no regular Department of Surgery would ever approach. I mean, they're doing like 100 bottles a day. And I think that was really valuable to hear from someone who's already doing it as part of their clinical workflow 100% of the time.
Just to change gears a little bit, you know, we have a surgeon, we have a primary care physician, and we, of course, have a radiologist on this panel. Imaging, 3D printing starts with good imaging, and of course that relies upon radiologists. It's good to know that going forward we're still going to be needed. How do you both see a radiologist's insights as influential, important, and relevant in the creation of the 3D printed surgical model? Clearly you need us. How can we best help you?
I think we must work closely because we need to create those protocols of the imaging, whatever it is, CT, MR, PET scan, should be protocolized together to get the best STL file to be printed. I think it's not so easy to pick the right sequence from the right imaging to get the best validated 3D printed model. Many reasons and many facts can influence this model to be inaccurate. So we must choose carefully the protocols. We must choose carefully the imaging modalities to choose and sequences to get the best result. And this process must be created and done in a close manner with the radiologist.
So
yeah, I would agree with that a lot.
Sorry, Henry, go right ahead. No, please.
I was going to say, you have the technical expertise to understand, like as he was saying, there are a lot of effects that can, like yesterday I was looking at an image on a patient and the streak effect from his portacath was really affecting the thing that we needed to desperately get detailed view on. And so, you know, I called the radiologist and I said, hey, you know, I can't figure out what's going on in this patient's lung apex because, you know, there are like rays of sunshine coming through there. And can we do another image that will not have that? He goes, oh yeah, let me re-protocol that for you. And we were able to get a better image. Now, we weren't 3D printing that image, but had we been, there were definitely artifacts that would have affected the quality of my print. The other challenge we found, particularly in head and neck imaging, is that you end up with so many polygons because there's so much stuff going on in the head that 3D printing software will choke. We had a Lafort 3 fracture, a facial fracture that we were printing. And I mean, there was like 5 million polygons in the model. And the 3D printing software did not really appreciate trying to manipulate 5 million polygons. Whereas on screen, the 3D model, it was totally fine. So working with the radiologist to understand that, first of all, I don't need this whole part of the skull. Like, just chop that away. I don't need all the turbinates in the nose. Like, I'm only interested in this, 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 and this, because we're going to put plates here. And I think that's where having the radiologist assist of understand where do I need high quality surfaces and where is it just nice to know.
It seems to me also that given our ability now to interact clinically the way we're interacting now virtually, is ideal, that we can project and share 3D models wherever the radiologist happens to be, wherever the surgeon happens to be, wherever the person who's creating the model happens to be. And so it seems to me that we should be leveraging technology like this to benefit patients. And that gets back to the point that you don't need $1 million lab. You need the ability to collaborate. So kind of as a final question, I guess, as we're winding down, Solomon, what do you think are the elements to optimal, great teamwork, collaboration, ending where we started? This is a team sport for our patients, between radiologists, surgeons, and the rest of the medical team. And who else might need to be on the team to optimize this for patient care that people may not have thought of?
Well, what I did in my MDT meetings in orthopedic oncology, we started to use those 3D PDFs, the STL files on the screen, together with a CT image and MRI image and PET scan, and the model on the table. And in the past 2 years, there is an engineer in each MDT meeting. So what he's catching up in those meetings is amazingly valuable. That's something the surgeon don't see, and sometimes there are designers with us. So these discussions with designers and engineer make the surgery plan and the surgeon's thoughts very creative and open the scope of the surgery. And as much as we are doing it more and more, we see that surgeons start to think differently. So the old traditional way they thought, and the textbook is just opening to think a more creative way, not putting the patient at risk. We are all doing what we are taught to do. And still we are in the scope of safetiness of oncology. We are still doing better, saving bones, saving joints, saving limbs, just because thinking differently with those 3D printing models and 3D printing tools. And I think the change must come from there to engage surgeons in every MDT meeting and try to engage them to think differently and to not to neglect their old ways, but to add a level of thinking to their own, their previous thoughts and expertise.
Just before, Henry, your final thoughts, just a quick question for both of you. We've talked a lot about the orthopedic, and those are some of the most obvious applications for 3D printing. What are some of the others you think may evolve over the next couple of years in clinical care for 3D printing to benefit patients? Where else should clinicians be thinking?
What's interesting is I think procedural education has been an area that I've seen a lot of my business inside the hospital go after. So the first, and 100% of Harvard medical students use this model, which I thought was pretty cool that I made, which was for our radiology department. They wanted to teach how to place a biliary drain using a fluoroscope. And to me, it seemed like an easy enough procedure, because when you watch our interventional radiologists do it, they've done 20,000 of them. And so when they do it, like watching Seth do it, it looks simple, but then you actually try to do it and you're like, my God, this is the hardest thing ever. How do you think like this? And so they wanted to produce a working model that you could actually do that on. And so we actually took my colleague's father's MRCP, which is an MRI of his biliary tree. We segmented it, and then I 3D printed it actually in paraffin wax. We poured silicone around it and then put it in my oven. Luckily, I'm married to a surgeon who doesn't freak out when you do these things. And I melted out the wax on the inside, and you're left with a hollow biliary tree. And now to teach the sort of concept of 3D imaging, all the Harvard medical students, I think it's on their ICU rotation or the ER rotation, do a PTBD placement in our IR suite. We did that, and then for our cardiac surgery department, there's a surgery, the mitral valve repair, which turns out to be the most dangerous surgery in surgery. I did not know that. And the placement of that ring is incredibly dangerous, to the point where I discovered that fellows in cardiac surgery don't ever get to do it, because it's so dangerous that they don't actually let them do it, even under supervision. So the first time that someone actually places a ring in its entirety is as the attending. And that seems somewhat surprising. And so to improve patient safety, they asked me to make a operable mitral valve. And the trick was, could we make it cheap enough that every single resident in our surgery department could use one? So we gave ourselves a $15 budget and a $5 reload budget. And then we had the idea that it would be collapsible so you could mail it out to other schools and stuff like that. And so we built one. And I think the key there was working between the radiologist and the surgeon to, one, figure out how the hell do you even generate a 3D model of a mitral valve? And then two, what is the essence of the procedure? And I imagine, Solomon, you work a lot with your radiologist to say, I don't need a whole femur. I know what a femur looks like. I only need this part of the femur because that's the part with the cancer or whatever. And so the same was true in the heart. Initially, the surgeons wanted a full heart. And I said, is there anyone in the operating room operating on a heart who doesn't know what a heart looks like? Because I hope the answer to that is no, because that's literally week one of med school. And so what is it of the heart? And of course, it turns out to be a little, matchbox sized area that's actually what they care about, which is where you put the stitches right next to the conducting system of the heart. And so we actually just made that. And then it had to be on the right angle, and then we had to simulate a bunch of other stuff. And it was fascinating collaborating around that. And I think education around things that are either incredibly dangerous or really hard is a great application, because, as you were talking about with Solomon, like a pelvic surgery is a big deal, right? I mean, you don't just casually talk about going into the pelvis like you might for a gallbladder. And so having a simulator, that was actually the first simulator we built out at Tufts, was a pelvic surgery simulator, was figuring out how can we make, a pelvis that you can put trocars into and then operate down in there and make all the obstacles where they should be. And how do I make the ureter hard to find so that you can accidentally cut it? And working with our radiologists to make a representative model. And you guys are the only people who've seen 20,000 CT scans of a pelvis and can tell us, yeah, this patient's ureter that you're going to build your model off of is not what the other 19,000 looked like. And I think that's something that you guys are really helpful in building these models, which is, what is a typical average, find me an average patient in your library so that we can use them as our base teaching model.
Solomon, any final comments?
Well, I think in the past 5 years, we did almost 1,000 cases, clinical cases. I think half of them are orthopedic and half of them are from other disciplines, surgical disciplines. So we work with all disciplines, with all kinds of surgeons, and in the real clinical cases. So they are coming with a problem, with a carcinoma of their kidney, of carcinoma of the tumor of the pancreas, of the liver, and we build this model. In case of a liver, it helps them to see the adjacent vessels, the biliary system, the arteries and vein, and to plan their cuts and plan their approach. And sometimes they are sufficient with a virtual model, sometimes we print. And it happens in all disciplines. So we work with eye surgeons with tumor of the orbit or fracture of the floor of the orbit. And it's cross surgeons, cross disciplines. So there's no discipline that cannot benefit from 3D printing and models. So sometimes I can deliver the old flow like a tooling and implant, but any others, a 3D model or a 3D printing model can do the same impact as a tool.
Very cool. It's been said about artificial intelligence in radiology that artificial intelligence will not replace radiologists, but radiologists who don't use artificial intelligence will be replaced by those who do. What I'm hearing loud and clear is the same about 3D printing over the next couple of years, that it's not going to replace what we do as a clinical team, but clinical teams that embrace this amazing technology definitely will replace, and in the benefit of patient care, probably should replace those that don't embrace this advanced technology. Very, very exciting stuff. And so with that, I'd actually like to hear Henry, Solomon, thank you both very much. I'd like to hear from the audience. So, David, can I turn this back over to you and we'll open up the floor to questions?
Yes, David. Thanks. There's a great conversation, and we do have a lot of good questions from the audience. The first one might be good for you, David. Have any radiology organizations organized a group dedicated to 3D printing?
It's a great question, and not that I'm aware of. It was actually, sadly, one of the things that I was looking forward to most exploring at RSNA, but not that I'm aware of. Henry or Solomon, are you aware of any radiology-sponsored organizations to do this?
I will answer it. Well, there are some radiologist groups, especially in North America, that they did some 3D printing hubs, but the level of service they will give the surgeons or any clinician will be a segmentation only, and maybe to print a simple model. They will not go ahead to surgical planning or aid in any way on surgical planning and tooling. So usually you get deliveries of segmentation and modeling.
Okay. Our next question maybe is good for Henry. The person's wondering what your thoughts are on using non-FDA approved software for segmentation, for instance, a 3D slicer and mesh mixer to create models and cutting guides.
Yeah, so that's a fairly common question we get at the hospital is like, what can I and what can't I use? And as in everything in life, it's really about context. Like, what are you planning to do? Like, certainly I wouldn't use non-approved anything if this thing is going to be attached to the patient. Like I wouldn't use non-approved software to make a hip implant, for instance. But, especially when we're talking about educational models and procedural teaching and things like that, I think you can be much more liberal than you would if you're making a bespoke device for a patient.
And here's a follow-on question. And Henry, maybe you can take this one too. Is it important that the models are sterilizable for surgical guides if being used in the OR?
Yeah, there are more myths about the sterilizability of 3D printed stuff than, the number of times I've heard people go, oh my God, you're putting plastic in the autoclave, it's going to melt. Despite the fact that 100 degrees C isn't actually particularly that hot. Anything that's actually going to be in the OR that's going to be touched by the surgeon when they're scrubbed obviously has to be fully sterile. However, if the surgeon is using it to sort of represent the CT scan in 3D, it's just going to sit on the Mayo stand and just be looked at and admired. That doesn't obviously need to be as sterile. However, I took a view on, we've done several trials on 3D printed medical devices that I created where they were not inside the patient, they were on the patient, they were various clips, et cetera, to hold things. And even though they did not require sterility from a medical standpoint, because 3D printing technology is new, I wanted to make sure that, God forbid, there was a perioperative infection, that would not get sourced back to 3D printed material being in the operating room and have it shut down the 3D printing program. And so out of an abundance of caution, everything went through the autoclave. That being said, there are some danger things you have to watch out for in sterilizing models. So hollow models should never, ever, ever be gas sterilized because if there's a small pinhole, the ethylene oxide can get in the model and slowly leach out, which is, of course, lethal. So we generally try to use autoclave sterilization, and if at all possible, the model should go to your central sterilization division so that everybody agrees that they know what they're doing, and the little indicator strips and stuff trip. So that's just what we've been doing with sterilization. There are plenty of, particularly in the resin printer world. So, for instance, the Formlabs printers we use for our surgical guides, they have an FDA-cleared resin for surgical guides, which is specifically designed to be autoclaved, which made the autoclave people happier at the hospital that we weren't going to be melting plastic all over their machine.
Okay. Thank you, Henry. The next one, maybe Solomon can take a step out. It says, as a surgeon, what would you say is most important, color or the feel and tissue mimicry of the models?
I don't think there is any one of the best importance. There is a place for everything. Well, it depends what you want to do. It depends what is the problem of the surgeon, what the kind of surgery and the complexity. If, let's say, there is a liver tumor, that what you can give to this surgeon is the best model you can give was transparency of the liver tissue, and he must see the adjacency and the proximity of the tumor to the vessels and the biliary tract. So then color will be very important to show him through the tissue. And then if the same surgeon with the same tumor wants to practice and simulate his surgery dry run before surgery, then you can mimic this tissue as the same as liver tissue. And you have all kinds of materials that you can mimic all human tissue, and then surgeons can practice before. So it's basically procedure dependence.
Henry, did you want to weigh in on that one too?
Yeah, I mean, I think as Solomon was saying, which I completely agree with, it's really what are you going to do with this? So if you're making a model for operative practice, then the functionality, not just the feel, but the functionality of the tissue matters. So like when we did that mitral valve repair model, it had to take stitches and, to be honest, tear just like a mitral valve would. So we did a lot of engineering on how to make, mitral valve tissue that could take a stitch, but if you pulled a little too hard, you'd tear the valve leaflet. And I mean, just by pure luck, they happened to come out to the right colors, but that really wasn't, I mean, by the time you're a cardiac surgeon, you should pretty much be able to imagine that even a green heart valve is still a heart valve. We haven't found that the physical appearance has been important at the postgraduate education level. We have found appearance to be more useful at the undergraduate medical education level, so medical students. People who are in practice have a lot more, because they've seen the anatomy so many times, they're less fooled. One of the more famous things we did at our medical center, there was a GYN procedure on the uterus that it was an invasive procedure, and they couldn't figure out how to 3D print a model that did exactly what they wanted, and they ended up actually using green peppers from the supermarket because it turned out to have the exact right feel and functionality. And obviously uteruses are not green, nor are they made of pepper, but it actually worked really well, and of course was incredibly cheap. So I think it really depends what you're doing, right? If your bones aren't white, hopefully an orthopedic surgeon can make the mental leap that they know that bones are white when they see them in the body. So we haven't really found the appearance to be key. It's more of, if you need to put a stitch in it, well, there has to be something in there that can take a stitch. And, if we're doing a radiology procedure, the plastic can't be radiolucent, right? Because otherwise it's just invisible on the screen. So we've worked a lot more on the functional side than on the appearance side.
Okay. Here's another one for you, Henry. How critical is a 510K clearance for 3D printing models for clinical practice?
Yeah, I mean, I think this goes along with the first question, which is what are you using it for? So, one of the more common, really complicated models I've seen around the medical centers in Boston have been right next door to us is Children's Hospital, and their congenital heart defect program, put back together these incredibly genetically damaged hearts of babies. And it's very, very, very hard to figure out what's what. It's almost like a 3D puzzle. And so for the surgeons, they're mostly using the model just to be able to see it in 3D, where apparently on the screen it's a little tougher to, they want to be able to grab it and say, well, can I even get a clamp there? And I think for those kinds of uses, much less important versus if you're going to be doing bespoke surgical guides that are going to go inside the operative field, inside the patient, you got to take the regulatory requirements very seriously. I mean, at that point, lives are on the line kind of thing. And so I think it really depends on your application, because clinical 3D printing isn't one thing. And so,
I mean, our view is anything that's going in the patient, needs to be seriously considered. Anything that isn't going in the patient, you can be a lot more loose.
Okay. I'll start next one with you, Henry, again, but Solomon or David can weigh in too. The person asks if the use of 3D printed surgical models and implants are billable procedures.
Yes, that was actually a key success item for, and this is a Tufts particularly, where the administration didn't really feel like they were going to pay for a surgical printing lab. We had a grant to establish it, but we wanted to make it self-sustaining, and so being able to bill as part of particularly ortho admissions became a really key item, because that is now, it is standard of care, and so every case that's going to the OR that's going to need an implant gets a surgical guide printed, and that is now a billable item. And so I think the only way to survive as a lab, I mean, maybe your hospital is super well funded, but if you're like any other hospital that I've ever been to, you're always like scraping, pennies out of the seat cushions. So making something billable is what makes it survivable. Because otherwise it's too easy to say, well, you guys operated for the last 2,000 years without 3D printed surgical guides, so we're not going to fund it for you.
Anybody else want to weigh in on that one?
Well, billable procedures, it means that the Ministry of Health recognize these procedures as billable, and then all the system will follow. As Henry said, we started the same with a grant and with a goodwill of the hospital management, but then we had to prove this efficacy to be billable and this procedure to be billable. We worked hand in hand with the Ministry of Health along 2 years to get the white paper that they will recognize this efficacy and safety of these procedures in surgery, mainly in oncology, and then made these procedures billable. And there is another way to get away. All the cases with implants that you can plan. Implants are billable, that's obvious for everyone. And then you can put those planning in the same bill of the implant. And while you do that, you can put many more procedure billable in the same hub that plans the implants.
Solomon, let me stick with you for the next question. In what areas of medicine do you see the greatest adoption of 3D printed surgical models and implants?
Well, as I mentioned before, it's obvious to do all the bony procedures, all the procedures that are in the skeleton, because it's obvious and very easy to segment, very easy to put a cutting jig, and to do the surgical planning on a hard tissue. But as I mentioned before, there's no discipline that cannot benefit from the procedure, from the technology. And it doesn't matter in which step they stop. They can benefit from the segmentation for the virtual model. We can go to virtual reality at that point of the STL creation. We can print, and they can benefit from the 3D printed model before surgery and plan on the printing. But other procedure can go all the way through jigs and cutting jigs and tooling to implants. So I don't think there is a dominance of any surgical discipline at this technology, even though skeletal disciplines can benefit more of the tooling. I think in an overall view, everyone can benefit.
Okay. Henry, maybe here's one for you. How can the use of 3D printing techniques be integrated to better impact clinical care?
Yeah, as Solomon has said several times, which is probably the most important thing to take away from all of this, is that the act of creating these models is in and of itself a useful exercise for understanding the patient. And so I think, when you get in the mindset of we're going to do 3D modeling of anatomy for procedures, that act leads to everyone in the care team who's involved in it having a much deeper understanding of what's wrong inside the patient and having more discussion around the abnormality and the plan to fix it. And I think that in and of itself, I mean, anytime you can increase communication and coordination in a healthcare team, is good. And so, getting people to think in 3D, getting people to look in 3D really changes the outcomes in a way, and just the way that people visualize the patient. Because if you're only looking at 2D images all the time, you're not sort of thinking about the 3D relationships of stuff to stuff. I mean, for the same reason that in a med school, we do anatomy on cadavers, right? I mean, we could, in theory, learn all the anatomy from a book, but it's not the same from what you see in the Netter book and when you go into the anatomy lab and you actually dissect that same tissue. And I think understanding 3D relationships, what's near what, is an incredibly valuable procedure. I mean, the example cited earlier of pelvic surgery, right? There's a lot of things you don't want to touch and hurt in the pelvis, and understanding where they are in 3D space relative to other things that you do want to touch is super important. And so I think that's a valuable tool to teach and learn and communicate. And I actually think it's a super valuable tool to communicate with the patient, because I'm sure when you go to Solomon and you're like, hey, there's a 3-centimeter lesion, on the iliac crest, and you give a couple other adjectives, he sees it in his mind because he's seen 10,000 of them. But the patient who you're trying to consent and educate about the procedure that's about to happen to them has never seen any of them. And so really is both scared and not understanding what you're talking about. And sure, most of us bring it up on a screen and show them, but let's be honest, the average person on the street can't look at a CT scan and understand what they're seeing, versus if you hand them a 3D model of their tumor, and so I think that that is another thing we can think about is because the patient is the most important person in the team.
Well, that's interesting. That leads us right into the next question. How does the use of 3D printed surgical models and implants or guides improve patient outcomes? Have there been some studies of that? Henry, do you want to take that first, and then we'll ask Solomon after you?
I don't know about studies that have looked at it. I mean, studies have certainly shown that more educated patients are better. That certainly understanding what is going to be done to you and what is going to, what you're going to look like afterwards, is going to make the patient more engaged in their care. And in general, more engaged patients are more likely to, sort of buy into the care plan and execute the care plan, because sure, as doctors, we take care of the patient when they're acutely ill, and then the patient does the rest of it, right? I mean, Solomon fixes a bone, but the patient has to recover and do PT and all the stuff they've got to do once they leave the ward. They kind of have to buy into that, or you're not going to get a great outcome. And so we've certainly found that giving the patient more information, whether it's a 3D print, a regular printout of some labs, anything you can show them that said, this is what you used to be like when you were at 100%. This is what you're like now while you're sick. We'd like to get you back to this point, and here's why, we're going to do what we're going to do, especially if there's options. When you present a patient, well, we could do this surgery or that surgery, most of the time they stare at you blankly because they don't understand what the implications of one versus the other are.
Henry, I think, though, from a pure value perspective, everybody wins. For example, if we can shorten OR time, patient wins, system wins, surgeon wins. And as we move further towards value-based care, there's compelling evidence across the board that to varying degree, the more information we have going in, particularly 3D printing in orthopedics, we're shortening OR time. And that doesn't take a lot of convincing to a patient that they win.
Yep. No, that is a very good point. And certainly, less OR time makes administration happy. I mean, I know the head of our inpatient quality team can tell you the value of a minute. You're like, if I saved you a minute, what's that worth? And he can tell you exactly based on the specialty. He's like, thoracic OR, $1,500 a minute. So if you save me a minute, we win.
That's exactly right. And if we don't have to open 2 implants and we get the implant right the first time, and if we get 1 extra patient in a week, we know that a system is going to save an awful lot of money at the end of the year. And so although it may take a while for this to be universally reimbursed, getting back to an earlier question. There are savings to be made and in turn financial gains to be made by systems that adopt it.
Great.
Right, and seeing an extra patient a week means you help an extra person get healthy every week. So, not just financially, but hopefully we're providing better, more care. Yeah.
Our last question from the audience, and maybe Solomon can start this one. What 3D printing technology is most commonly used in your organization?
Well, the bread and butter of and the most used technology is the FDM, because it's a very comfortable and very good material that can work even when you do simulation and dry runs before surgery, and you want to try and validate your cutting jigs or any tooling on top of the model. So it's the main technology used, and I think it's the main technology used in all 3D hubs that I know. But the other technology that we use and mainly use is the SLA, because there is a possibility of printing with biocompatible materials, and those printers get more and more sophisticated and small, like desktop machines that you can use, and you can use even to print those models in multicolor and even your biocompatible sterilized jigs. And I think those two technologies are mainly used, and if you need more sophisticated technologies like multicolors or like Stratasys machine or multicolors or any other consistency, you can outsource those printing.
Henry, do you want to weigh in on that one too?
Yep. So our orthopedic surgical guide lab is all SLA. So we have a bunch of Form Labs, Form 3 and Form 3L printers. So the L is their large model. So when we want to print the whole femur, we can do it. So for us, since the majority of the printing is for guides, whether saw guides or drill guides, those need to be sterilizable, biocompatible prints. And just from a straight resolution standpoint, it's pretty hard to beat SLA. I mean, we're accurate to 15, 20 microns on those prints. As opposed to when we're particularly in the educational space where, you don't want to spend a lot of money. The FDM printing is extremely cheap and lets you typically produce a much larger print than most SLA printers can produce. For some models, we have outsourced. I mean, we do print on our FDM printers in carbon fiber reinforced nylon, glass reinforced nylon, a lot of the engineering plastics. But it's easier in many ways to farm that out because those are tough things to print in. We have thought about purchasing our own SLS, so laser sintering printers. We've also thought about actually getting metal capable printers. The challenge there has been if we're going to start doing bespoke 3D printed metal implants, the expense goes up, exponentially versus farming it out. We have done some bespoke machines, take a billet of stainless steel and machine it. That's easier to do in many ways. But I think Solomon really hit it right. If you need exotic prints like multicolor with transparency, things you're going to do on an objet or like one of the other PolyJet printers, there's very little reason that you need that in-house. The reason to have the printers in-house is because, the patient's admitted at 5 p.m. and you want the surgical guide for the 7 a.m. case, and we can do that when it's in-house. And obviously you're not sending it out to a service bureau to come back. But for the very complex service bureaus where the printers are, as expensive as a Ferrari, it makes sense to farm it out because they're going to have both the ability to spread that expense over many people, and more importantly, they'll have the expertise to use it.
Okay. Well, thank you. David Gruen, do you have any final comments as we wrap up here? If not, I think that's all we have time for today. I want to thank IBM Watson Health for sponsoring this webinar, and to our 3 guests for participating. It's been really fascinating, and thank you to the audience for your Q&A and for your attendance. And we hope to see you at another Healthcare Innovation webinar real soon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much.